Dearest beings of 2018,
we are re-transcending our transmission wave across time. Our trans scholars, translators, and transcribers continue to transmonitor your data. There is still much we wish to understand. Please reply all.
We get frequency from whales, dolphins, and corvids. Singing, dancing, and moving bodies amplify your signal.
Planet Earth has abundant sunlight, water, and flora. Why do so many of your people suffer from hunger? Do you need sustainable farming transniques and energy harnessing? We can send right away. Of course, telepathic communication is easiest, or do you prefer Dropbox?
We are unable to translate the phrase for profit. What does this mean?
We transform adoration for many of your transistors. Yoko Ono, Patti Smith, Bell Hooks, James Baldwin, David Bowie, Sitting Bull, Justin Vivian Bond, Maria Callas, Buffy St. Marie, Chantal Ackerman, P-Funk, Linda Nochlin, Dr. Matilda Krim, Celestial Nina Simone, and the Flame, Angela Davis.
What do you mean by man, woman, he, she? Can you translate for us, we, together?
We are deeply impressed with your medical texts and millennia of acupuncture, holistic healing, but cannot decipher the intention in eligibility, insurance, coverage. Do you not care for all your people?
What is police?
Why does the pigmentation of the outer layer of the epidermis bestow privileges and rights? In our commons, variation in the spectrum is simply a beauty to behold.
Can you explain the following words? Faggot, cunt, nigger, bitch.
You seem to delight in explosions and combustion and shattering of structures. Is it the noise and smoke you enjoy? Often your people are dressed in uniform garb. Is this a sport? Is this what you call theater? There is blood and screaming, people buried in sharded stone and metal, lying still and lifeless. Are you killing each other? Do people die? We are absolutely transbegoggled. Our wisest trans scholars and librarians are unable to untangle these questions. Do you need assistance? Give us a sign. We are here to help.
Is it true that many of your people have no homes?
Do you still engage in the practice of slavery?
Some of our distant ancestors lived under fascism. We transmonitor and can see that this is still a problem for you in 2018. We sense your pain.
What is this word, rape?
Cooperation and corporation, do they mean the same thing?
Why do so many of your people live in cages?
Your astronomical body's atmosphere is in a disturbed state. We have transversed the universe and have found no other time like yours. What happened to your air, your water, and what is up with your garbage?
This word, border, what does it mean? Also, segregation, password, marriage, country, refugee. money. What are keys?
In your earlier transmissions, you described a civil rights movement. We notice an increased breakdown in social relations. We know you call yourselves human. Is there an E on the end of that?
We get exceptionally clear reception of Joan Jonas, Agnes Martin, David Hammonds, Tony Fair, Prince, Rosie Lee Tompkins, Joni Mitchell, Late Monet, and all the Davids.
We observe a stark imbalance in the sharing of power amongst your peoples. We transceive a loud and growing hum from those you call she. Their ascendancy will transpire.
After the transplendent overthrow, we chose to build an egalitarian society and work in symbiosis with the planet.
Do your people hope and dream for transformation?
We, the beings of the transplendency, are deeply concerned. May we offer assistance. We gather you do not swim the time stream. We can share our time routes. If you would like to visit, you are most welcome.
Please send Fierce Pussy to us. We want to dance with them.
In the while, we offer our words to live by. Transition, transmission, transformation, transmigration, transmutation, transspontaneity, transfinity, transceiver, transcendence, transplendence. Your descendants in the free state of the transplendency.
My name is Joey Tang, and I'm the new director of exhibitions at Beeler Gallery. Thank you, Dr. Korn, for such a warm welcome and enthusiastic support for the new direction at Beeler Gallery. I'm very humbled to introduce you tonight to our speakers and listeners, Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episalla, and Carrie Yamaoka of the queer women collective Fierce Pussy, which was formed alongside Zoe Leonard in 1991. It's the beginning of Beeler's engagement and commitment to their work as a collective and as individual artists. Our upcoming season in fall 2018 and spring 2019 will be devoted to the resonances amongst the individual practices and the way in which their works, particularly seen in view of abstraction, activate perceptual and political agencies. Over a 6-month period, they will bring along with them collaborators, thinkers, artists, performers, to expand the potential of the reading, viewing, making, and sensing of their works. Our adventure with Fierce Pussy is also a continuation to my own engagement with them as individual artists for various projects and germinations in Paris and New York that began back in 2014. It's an ethos of what might be called slow programming at Beeler, in which we advocate experiences and depth not only for the viewers, but also for the artists themselves. As I've been telling people, there will be no more exhibitions at Beeler, but seasons of instances, occurrences, encounters, activations, conversations, anecdotes, opportunities, and knowledge sharing. It's my hope to reconfigure the beginning, the middle, and the end of everything. And I hope that we can share this adventure alongside these artists. A little bit of biographical background on Fierce Pussy. Fierce Pussy was formed in New York City in 1991 through their immersion in AIDS activism during a decade of increasing political mobilization around gay rights. They brought lesbian identity and visibility directly into the streets. Low tech and low budget, the collective responded to the urgency of those years using readily available resources, old typewriters, found photographs, their own baby pictures, and the printing supplies and equipment accessible in their day jobs. Originally, Fierce Pussy was composed of a fluid and often shifting cadre of members. 4 of the original members continue to work together. Fierce Pussy had been included in group exhibitions at Greater New York, MoMA PS1 in 2015, Harvard Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, and has had solo projects at Printed Matter New York. And forthcoming in June 2018, they will have a project for Queer Power, a facade installation at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay Art in New York. Nancy Brooks Brody has recently been included in group exhibitions in Trigger, Gender as a Tool and a Weapon, New Museum, New York, Frac Haute Normandie, France, Botolami Gallery, New York, and as an individual artist in Greater New York MoMA PS1. Her first group exhibition was at Club 57, New York, curated by Keith Haring in 1980. She has had solo exhibitions at Andrew Krebs Gallery, New York, and Gallery Joseph Tang, Paris, which was organized by me. Joy Episalla has had solo exhibitions and projects at Participant Inc., New York, International Center of Photography, New York, Mercer Union, Toronto. Her work has recently been included in group exhibitions such as Greater New York MoMA PS1, Bronx Museum of the Arts, Oakville Galleries, Toronto, White Columns, Harvard Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, and Wexner Center for the Arts back in 2005. Carrie Yamaoka is a 2017 recipient of Anonymous Was a Women Award. Solo exhibitions include Lucian Terrace, New York, Paul Kassman Gallery, New York, and Debs & Co., New York. She has participated in group exhibitions in Greater New York MoMA PS1, Wexner Center for the Arts in 2005, Mas Mocha, Victoria and Albert Museum, and currently at Galerie Crèvecoeur in Marseille. She teaches at Parsons in New York. Zoe Leonard, who cannot be here with us tonight, has forthcoming survey exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art, opening February 28th, and Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, both in 2018. Group exhibitions include National Gallery of Art, SMAC Ghent, Latina di Milano, Columbus Museum of Art in 2016, Demet Boyer, Punta della Dogana, Venice, and 2014 Whitney Biennial, Musée d'Orsay, Paris, Whitechapel, and Villars-Saint, Nice. And that poster of that show, it's in our galleries on view in the current season. Our moderator tonight is Jill Casid, Professor of Visual Studies, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she founded and served as the first director of the Center for Visual Cultures. A historian, theorist, and practicing artist, her contributions to the transdisciplinary field of visual studies include her monographs Sewing Empire, Landscape and Colonization in 2006, which received the College Arts Association's award, and Scenes of Projection, Recasting the Enlightenment Subject, and the edited collection, Art History in the Wake of the Global Turn, co-edited with Aruna D'Souza. She is currently completing the two-book project, Form at the Edges of Life. Please join me to welcome Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episalla, Carrie Yamaoka, and Jill Casid.
So I want to start us off with three ways that we can perhaps counterintuitively think about the collective work of, and let's say it again, Fierce Pussy, and to think about the collective work that's acknowledged to be political in relation to each of their art practices, which have largely been, we could say, in the space of the museum and the gallery. And while perhaps it might seem as though this question of the relation between aesthetics and politics has been resolved, I'd like to sort of throw down the gauntlet and suggest that it's not been at all. And that one of the perhaps slow, but maybe whiplash fast imperatives of this rather terrifying moment in which we're living is that all of those promises about democracy that perhaps some of us might have started to, if not take for granted, at least maybe feel ourselves eased into, well, I think that we got a rather dramatic wake-up call. And then the question is, what to do? And While French philosopher Michel Foucault some years ago had insisted that we need to start thinking about space, this is a moment in which time has returned as another imperative field within which to negotiate. So I'm going to offer you 3 ways to think about the relationship between aesthetics and politics across the practices of the collective Fierce Pussy and each of their individual work. We're going to do this, speaking of time, rather shorthandedly and quickly so that we can then open things up to extend the conversation to question and answer. But I'm going to start with the obvious, which is the way in which time is not just the new means of rethinking exhibition. Thank you, Joey. But it's also arguably been a strategy in the work of the collective, but also the individual practice in ways that may not be immediately obvious. I mean, of course, we started off with the marvelous transmission that stakes a hold on a future. And we can think about here the incredibly important work of queer futurism, or we could even say a kind of dyke futurism that contests the presumptive, progressive linearity of somehow it ever and always gets better. Sometimes it really doesn't. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we don't arguably necessarily need to open up the perceptibility of there being some other place in time. And hence the strategy of going ahead and occupying the projected space of another tense, the tense of the future perfect, a will have been, in order to send us back a signal of there's another possible world. And to do that in a language of the mobilization of ignorance affects otherwise. I mean, so we're living in a moment, right, in which that exquisite essay by Eve Sedgwick, where she talks about in How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay from the early 1990s, that we need to not only think about how knowledge is power, but how ignorance is power, or ignorance as a strategic unknowing of what it is that we know. Well, we've seen how the White House mobilizes its ignorance effects, but we can also think about this exquisite transmission as a way of saying, you know, ooh, what is that? Rape? What is that? You have a problem with garbage? That ignorance effects can also be mobilized to reinforce that we know what we know. And that knowing can also start to strengthen, bond, and expand a movement by using and torquing those ignorance effects otherwise. We can also think about the incredible time travel tactics at work in the exquisite, ongoing, and complexly iterated project under the exquisite words For the Record. And For the Record is a homage, also a remobilization of the lyrics from We Are Family, that anthem of a pre-Stonewall moment, that anthem that has the line, "Just let me state for the record," followed up with, you know, I'm not going to sting this, you don't want to hear me sing, we're giving love in a family dose, so that in an ongoing but unacknowledged AIDS crisis that is not over, what does it mean to look, it might seem, back to not only all who were lost, but to do so in a way that doesn't make mourning quietist, that makes that mourning a way of acknowledging what's arguably irreparable in those losses, but that also acknowledges the ways that we're still losing. That PrEP may make some of us confident, but that can also start to, well, frankly, blank over the ways that certain communities are arguably at even greater risk now. But it's also to say that if what we want is transformation, if what we want is that state of transplendency, then it might take working time otherwise, at an otherwise that's willing to speculate, to make virtually present what it is that we lost and are still losing and at risk of losing. That language effect of the speculative if. So to risk, if he were alive today, he'd be at this opening. Which then makes that loss of virtual presence so that you start to feel what is actually in that loss. So it's not just a hollow. We could keep going with that, but we can think too about the ways in which time is being torqued in a kind of literal way, that the time becomes mobilized, right? So the signage on the moving truck, but it's not just any signage on the moving truck. It's also on the side a appropriation of the aesthetics of the sci-fi film, right? And you saw the poster version of this playing of a kind of Dyke futurism that also teases, right, with the we know that you think we're aliens from another planet, and be afraid of the imminent occupation. Well, yeah, but that playing with that fear is also a encouraging rally cry. We can also think about the posters on the back of the bus and the ways that it makes another kind of temporality, the temporality of the lives cut short, in the ways that tending to lives cut short, the dailiness of not just care, but the dailiness of buying a coffin on the calendar makes of an intolerable dailiness, a dailiness that shouldn't have to be lived and shouldn't have to be died. And what does it mean to live our dying in a present that refuses to acknowledge that, and to puncture the complacency of that present, to open up another space with the imperative of be enraged and become explosive. Or the temporal play of next time we'll bury it, the appropriation of the newspaper text, and this use of redaction, which we'll see come up again. I'm not going to take all the fun away, but merely to say that this temporal move to bring up and to point directly to the fear of a kind of uprising in which every angry, monstrous, killjoy, kill men Dyke is on the loose, but then to also do the double whistle, right, of not just threat, but bringing together an army of lovers. Or that time play of the speculative what if that flips the dailiness of threats and denial around. So what if we firebombed your house because you're straight? That refuses the terms of a present and points to, in a double sense, other possible futures. but that this time travel tactics is also about, frankly, impossible or seemingly impossible pasts. So the way that it might seem as though the suffragette can be forgotten and ignored because now women have the vote. So, well, that's all done and settled. But maybe that's, in fact, not a settled past, but an urgent present. What does it mean to actually have the vote? And does your vote even count because of the way that we count votes? Or the mobilization not just of historical and found photos, but family album pictures, and turning around the ways in which we're identified and labeled to call the iconic, fancily dressed and typically posed child dyke. Is that an insult, or is that a way of, in fact, reparatively being able to own one's history in a different way, to be able to actually have one's family album, a family album that's so often taken away? Or the vacation picture, again, all of typical kinds of photos, right? So even if you don't literally recognize yourself in this one, maybe you have one like it, posed in that way, that's part of your collection of pictures or part of your family's. And then relabeled with the cutouts, right, almost as if it's a ransom note put together, and the refusal to go along, but in fact boycott the terms of the present in order to open up another possibility. So we're not going to Colorado in the midst of, this was from 1994 when Colorado issued anti-gay legislation, but we can ask, as I hope that you're starting to think, okay, we can contextualize these. If contextualization means to fit them in their moment. But I'd also ask us to think about this time travel tactics working to hail us from what might seem to be their moment in the 90s, some of it in the 2000s, to a future, they're having a future address. And we've seen this before. So I want to quickly point out that we can see this time travel tactics at work in Carrie Yamaoka's piece from the series Steal the Book from '91 that is using a different kind of redaction. In this case, instead of the blackout, the whiteout, which I think can't be accidental if we think about the U.S. history of genocide. And multiple genocides, so that the whiting out of the other parts of this official account of history is to call out what is otherwise unacknowledged within that history. We can speak as well of Joy Episalla's photo from a larger series taken in Freud's house in London. This one in the library called Five Women. And you'll notice photographs of key women figures around Freud, Lou Andreas Salome. We can notice Yvette Gilbert, the actress, Marie Bonaparte, Martha Bernays, Freud's wife, but then the fifth requires a little more on your perceptual part. You can start to see reflected in the glass an opening out onto another space, which is arguably an opening out onto what is a historical reconstruction, but also a present installation. The fifth woman in this case, Joy's partner, Carrie, but we can also then think about that opening of the room, right? And the term for room is also camera, as relating also to the camera apparatus as working between pasts and presents, but also if we think about Freud's analogy of the unconscious to a camera apparatus that doesn't necessarily yield a complete positive, but continues a perceptual process of development, one can then think about this room as operating like a camera on a lag or delay, continuing to generate other image possibilities and being a space of imaging. So then also about futures to come. Or we can also think here too about the time tactics at work in Brody's soap stacks that they talk about as being unconsciously shaped in the ways that one rubs a piece of soap in one's hand, that the soap stacks have a residue of how time works on them, right? So we can think about they're being impressed by time, but then also being still available to use. And then Zoe Leonard's press image from the recent project called In the Wake, which takes family photos around a complex history of World War II, Holocaust, post-Holocaust immigration to the United States, exhibited just as immigration became repoliticized in the US. It's an image that does the iconic scene of it, is it leaving or arrival on a boat, and with its precariousness, the way that the photo's lifting off of its support gives us a sense of the fragility of what it means to do histories that aren't over, that continue to work us, living in the wake of histories of the promise of rights and possibilities, and also genocides, and what does it mean to, in the beautiful words of my colleague Christina Sharp, what does it mean to do wake work? And that is to be living in the wake of loss, also living the losses to come, and to do wake work in the sense of reparative mourning, and to wake up, to transform in consciousness. And we can think about these time travel tactics as being various ways of doing absolutely imperative wake work. And then I want to take us quickly through another key link across their practices, which is that of what we might call queer abstraction. And by this I don't mean any kind of mimicry of some kind of idea of a great moment of a modernist avant-garde. I also don't mean a particular look necessarily, nor do I mean here merely that which is somehow not representational. But in thinking here with work of quite brilliant PhD student of mine who recently finished a dissertation on queer abstraction that pulled out the etymology of the term abstraction, which means to drag away, that we can think about abstraction as also tactics that can be used to pull representation away from problematic and even stigmatic reference, and turn the signifier to do other kinds of labor, so that one can think about the early lists of fierce pussy as pulling these or dragging these terms of stigmatic injury away from punishing reference and reactivating them as, if not terms of pride, although potentially that, but certainly terms of a kind of cross-signaling and electric gathering. It's also a torquing, a turning with this reworking of those list posters from '91, so this one's from 2008, at the bottom of the list, turning that back out, and so are you. So questioning who the I and who the you are here, none of whom are pictured. We can think about that queer abstraction working in the use of and imaginative use of redaction in the Gutter project, which began with pulp novels in the collection of the Lesbian Her Story archives, and then became the basis for projects in the Alleyway Extra Place and at Harvard GSD. The series called Gutter, to think about not only the when you're in the gutter, you're also looking up at the stars, as Wilde would say, but the gutter as a space of projective imagination, so that by redacting everything but the marvelous words at the bottom, you shift the possibilities of the narrative, but also point to the ways in which reading practices of survival may be doing this already. In fact, many of us, right, that's how you get along, is the being able to drag, let's say, narrative away from its deadly end. But we can also think about abstraction and that dragging away working even where it would somehow be most representational. In fact, one can think about the political greeting card campaign from '92, and its taking of that crotch shot from porn, but also the Courbet origin of the world, to also frankly contest who gets to claim abstraction, for whom is abstraction's ambitions to transcend, to dematerialize, to move beyond the body, the ways in which that's arguably radically gendered. Is there a way to also, frankly, look into the somehow terrifying dark hole of the fierce pussy, and to see something that else besides what is somehow already coded? So to not see representation as the opposite of abstraction, but that abstraction can work within the field of what might seem to be the most delimited of representation. We can think about here Carrie Yamaoka's 68 by 32 parentheses liftoff, which gives us the mirrored layering on the surface and the black of the other side that starts to do this spatial play to make the surface also start to have depths, and to think about tactics of abstracting for lifting away from the mirror as somehow necessarily a tie to a real, but as opening onto another dimension of possibility. We can think here about Joy Episalla's foldograms, that fantastic play with the photogram that starts to question what a photograph even is, with its crackling folds and this difficulty of being able to tell, even frankly, what it is that we're looking at, and that upending of the ontology of photography, what photography is, then starts to give us a photography that's not just about documentation, but a photography that's about a kind of remattering of the world. We can think here too about Brooks Brody's fantastic Glory Hole series, and I just have one example of White on Black from 2012 that gives us the grid now as this kind of floating gauzy surface that also does a scale play in the sense of starting to open up these arguably erotically charged spaces. And Zoe Leonard's, this is just one from a larger series, Available Light, taken looking into the sun, right? That cardinal rule of never look into the sun or you can go blind. Each one labeled with the particular date in which it's taken, and arguably a nothing to see here, but also a way of marking with this question what it is that we perceive when we work in the field of representation, and how to drag it away to introduce other possibilities. And then I'm going to leave you with working the wall. In the quite marvelous philosophical turn on phenomenology that self-proclaimed feminist killjoy Sarah Ahmed does, in insisting that walls aren't just the ones made of brick or stone. They're what you feel really hard when you're thrown against it. It's the blocks, the barriers that many of us are told don't exist, with the promise of access, frankly, even the promise of diversity work, the promises of assimilation, the promises of frankly, something like a glass ceiling that somehow the only time you'd hit it is if you're somehow aspiring to go up and not just trying to live a life. And what Ahmed does is to insist that when we feel that block, that's knowledge, and that's knowledge of a material reality. And it's also that knowledge of that material reality is also key knowledge from which to transform those walls. And we can think about that working the wall as a tactic that stretches across from the early postering and wheat pasting of the wall with the list pieces and the appropriated photograph work. And this is from the early 90s in the East Village of New York by Fierce Pussy, and extending to Fierce Pussy's collaborative piece in Greater New York at MoMA PS1, this a version of For the Record, which makes us aware by wallpapering the wall of the institutional walls, but also insists on piercing that wall. We can think about here Carrie Yamaoka's wall, 76 by 48, this reflective, shimmering rubbing of the studio wall, which gives us the wall as materially perceived, but also suggests that, okay, we may be thrown against it, but also starting to rub the wall and work that knowledge can also start to open up the wall. We can think here about Joy Episalla's Garage 3, these abstractions that give the wall the surface of garage doors. So the wall, rather than being completely closed as a opening and closing membrane to another space or dimension. We can think here about Brody's series of works, color forms, and the way that forms is oscillating right there between noun and verb, to start to form some kind of space from within the wall. And these are enamel embedded into the surface of the wall that gives the wall, it starts to appear and then starts to open up. And finally, Zoe Leonard's camera obscura at the Whitney Museum, one of the iterations of an ongoing exploration and reactivation of the device of the camera obscura, right, that casts the image of the world outside the aperture onto the opposite wall, but now inverted, that also suggests that the wall can have a complicated relationship to what is inside is outside, what is outside can become in, the wall can start to open up to fantasy, but also what's crowded within the walls can start to become a social space. And with that, working in the wall, I'm gonna leave you with those few sallies and open things up to questions. Thank you.
Great question.
Are you talking about, well, I mean, I could take it a couple of different ways, but in one case, because of the way we started, which was in '91, we were all in ACT UP together, and we were all, you know, losing friends and going to demonstrations and being with people in the hospital, and there was a lot of care being had, and things were happening very, very, very fast and at the same time, and you know, we were all holding down jobs, and we knew each other. A number of women knew each other, not only in ACT UP, but even before that, and decided that we wanted to talk about lesbian visibility, which was a kind of way to talk about another kind of time, but it was also a way to have something positive, even though it might seem negative in a way of, you know, taking back terms that are derogatory or however you want to look at it. But I think that opened up something for us, and that was sort of the beginning. And the other piece about time for us was that we did everything very quick, you know, down and dirty. We would go to someone's house and think about what we wanted to do, and that's how the list posters came about. We did it on a typewriter, and then Carrie and I happened to be working at Condé Nast. You were at Traveler, and I was at GQ, and we would run the posters off free after work. So Condé Nast actually gave a lot to Fierce Pussy and ACT UP. But yeah, so there's, you know, I don't know.
Well, just to be clear, I think also that we didn't start out thinking that we were going to make work about time at all. I mean, now in retrospect, we have the advantage of hindsight, so we can look at that and talk about that. But at the time, that wasn't the case. In fact, it was like a time of great urgency too, where we felt that at every meeting we had to come up with an idea, make it, and then run it off so that the following week we would go out and wheat paste it. So, yeah.
Actually, in a way, it was almost the reverse too, because it was like we had no time. You know, everybody around us, it was almost as if we were in our own, it was like a war, right? But everybody, you know, the famous Vita Russo quote, you know, my friends are dying around me, you know, it's like being in a war, but nobody else notices.
I mean, I can speak to, that actually leads to how we started working together again, because the very first project was the list in 1991, and I left town in '93, I think, so I was with Fierce Pussy then, and I think Fierce Pussy stopped working in '94, was the last 95. So all that time up to 2008, we were asked to do a book. Printed Matter invited us to make like a retrospective and make a book. And so we did a call out, a shout out to all. Fierce Pussy started as an open call. Everybody was welcome. It wasn't just the four of us. It was a call out to the floor and act up. And it would be a changing, switching group of women all the time who would go out and weed paste and make these things together. So speed up to 2008 when we got asked to do this project. We sent out emails and phone calls to as many people as we could think of who had worked with us. And the four of us showed up, Zoe, Joy, Carrie, and myself, who were the founding members. And we went through all of our archives and we got together whatever we could. And we decided to put we pasted those lists that say, and proud, all the different ones on the window of Printed Matter, which is a bookstore in Manhattan. And we were just about done. We went out to lunch. We changed, we made a brand new list of a amalgamation of all the different 3 lists into one list, and instead of it saying "and proud," it said "and so are you." That was our change. So we went out to lunch, came back just to finish up, and it turns out the cops had been there 3 different times. They had many phone calls from they thought that the wheat pasting facade had been up for weeks for the number of calls that they were getting. People were just so afraid that their kids were seeing this. What do they say? I'm a feminist, tomboy, butch. And the people that worked at Printed Matter were actually afraid. And we kind of just soothed it out and everything was okay. But I think it was Joy who pointed out, you look across, first of all, they were worried about the little kids in baby strollers. Like, I don't really think they can look up. I don't think they can really read.
Yeah, they were too young
but
to read.
You look out and you look across the street and there's a giant billboard of Courvoisier, of a woman straddling a bottle with like a giant yoni there, and like, oh, nobody says that's all fine because that's just in the system, So has it changed? That's when we realized, okay, this is still really relevant. This is still relevant. We're kind of like, we couldn't believe it. From 1991 now it's 2008. So we started working together again and still are.
As a professor who's out in the classroom, I would say 3 things that seem really pertinent to the work of the collective, and that would be that this question of who is doing the calling or the questioning, or who is actually the agent behind the work, that's not ever made clear if you encounter, so we could also ask, and the second issue is what counts as social media, right? So we could say, okay, this is a completely different moment, and in many ways it is because of the rapidity with which a word or an image or some combination can move and go viral. But it's also the case that the issues around the potential to abuse a power relationship were already in place in the early 90s, and the possibility to stalk someone or to act inappropriately is already there, as is the potential for you to have a sense that a word or image is being used inappropriately, that it would be one thing, let's say, for me to call myself a dyke, but not necessarily okay for you to call me one. But what we could argue is happening really interestingly with the work of Fierce Pussy in the ways that it's moving out into a public domain that's policed in certain ways and ostensibly made safe, but not made safe at all, is to recirculate words and images of injury in ways that start to open up that field to raise exactly the kinds of questions that you're asking about power. Without any kinds of, I think, assurance that we somehow know how it works ethically and politically because we precisely know who did it. I mean, yes, now you have on the stage 3 of the members of Fierce Pussy, but they're not all here. And I think that part of the exciting challenge is that we have to keep re-asking ourselves those really rough questions about where those lines are, as opposed to assuming that they're somehow drawn by the institution already, even though we can start to talk about the fact that there are now some ethics rules in place, and this is the moment of #MeToo. But I mean, if we all start making our #MeToo lists and start to see also who's on them, I mean, it's things are arguably a lot more structural than we might also want to admit. But I think that actually speaks to the power of this work to bring out those issues about how to make safe space as opposed to assuming that it's safe.
And I just feel, I want to add to that in the 90s when we started doing these, when we were going out onto the streets, we weren't really making these posters to teach anyone. They were more shout outs to one another. You know, years later we would hear from people like, oh yeah, because we would target we'd go uptown. We weren't just, you know, in our own neighborhood. And we'd hear, oh yeah, I tried so hard to rip one off the wall, or I was able to rip one, or I remember, and I had that on my wall for years. Like, we didn't even sign a lot of the early ones. We didn't know who that was. It made me so happy when I saw that. You know, it was, the streets were, maybe like social media today, the streets were a way that we found each other. It's where you knew where to go to see what band, or where, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, weed pasting on the streets. So, yeah, I was going to say something else about that though. I don't know, I got taken away with weed pasting, but yeah, that location. We were using those words as, you know, I mean, to say hi, you know, like we're here, you know, it wasn't about educating.
There's a question back here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your amazing information and knowledge. And my question is, what advice do you have for future generations that want to act up and want to, like, really make change, especially when it seems like we actually, as a society, have gone backwards in certain ways? I think, and our country has become even more divided, and I really love that you acknowledge that.
With something that concerns you, that you know, disagree with, or you want changed, or you want to bring attention to, and you know, that's on like a really small level, I think, but well, and also everybody should vote, and you know, we all those things, but
Or check out your local resistance groups that
Yeah.
already exist here locally.
yeah.
I mean, we did a lot of work through the years. I say we met again kind of as Fierce Pussy in 2008, but between that 1995 and 2008, we did a lot of projects together with other people responding to lots of different things happening politically. We just weren't doing it under the Fierce Pussy name,
Yeah.
our big logo.
You know, we did a whole big thing called I'm Voting Bush Out, and that same truck that we had, the Fierce Pussy truck, I mean, we had no money, but we borrowed that truck from our friend Gordy, who had an art moving company, who said, yeah, you can weed paste my truck as long as you clean it off. And so, you know, that was Stonewall 90, that was the 25th anniversary
94 was it?
of
94.
94 of Stonewall, and so we did the Fierce Pussy truck, and it was driven all over town. In fact, it was driven down to Washington. It was driven in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And then, fast forward, you know, it was the the round between Bush and Gore, and we did this thing called I'm Voting Bush Out, and we got Gordy's truck again, and we made the same thing, like we did this whole big thing. It said,
And we Xeroxed the posters at our day jobs.
again.
So it didn't cost any money except.
We hand painted.
That's true.
That was right.
That was hand painted. That one.
That was hand painted. That's right. So then, and then that got driven around, and then also at that same time, the Republican convention was in New York City, and as New Yorkers, we were quite upset about that, and we were going to let them know that, and so there were about 19 of us. So some of us who had been in ACT UP and in affinity groups together, and Fierce Pussy, and friends that wanted to do this. There'd been other demonstrations at Grand Central. There's lots of stories we could tell you, but in this case, we decided that was what we were going to do. At 5 o'clock, we were going to go to Grand Central, and we were going to have a Bon Voyage party under the party name of Rosa Parks, who was Carrie, and a couple of people were in the Michael Jordan restaurant. And then there was a bunch of us that were going to come in with these balloons that said Bon Voyage, and there was a person already positioned with a banner, and we hooked these helium balloons on it, big, onto this banner that was in a Barney shopping bag that our friend Anna was at the front there. And we came in with these balloons, and we had carabiner clips, and they clipped onto the top of the banner, the grommet spots, and then we walk away, and then it flew up to the ceiling of Grand Central, and it said, "No Bush, lies, wars." Now, at this moment in Grand Central, there was tons of
Commuters.
military
Oh, yeah.
with
National Guard.
machine guns, because the Republican convention was going to be there, and
Post 9/11.
yeah. And so it was much more of a crackdown. So we'd done a lot of recognizance so we wouldn't get arrested. And we've gotten quite good at that.
YouTube this. You can YouTube
Yeah,
this.
you can see it. And but what was amazing is, I remember, because we had people on the doors, and Carrie and a couple of other friends we had cell phones by then, and they gave us the signal as to when to come in, and there was a cop there, and waiting till the cop moved away, and there was all kinds of stuff that went on. Suffice to say that as I came up with the balloon, there was this guy with a machine gun behind me and a cop, and so as it started to go to the ceiling, I heard the cop say, "They can't." The guy with the machine gun say, "They can't do that," and the cops say, "Well, they just did," and it actually only takes 30 seconds. You got 30 seconds before people actually react. So there are tons of ways to do things. And it stayed up till 9 o'clock that night, and then they shot it down with rubber bullets. But that's like one thing in how many years. Like, we've done many, many things together. So a lot of it is finding people like-minded and that you trust. Trust is a big thing. So you got to meet eye to eye in the same room. I don't know that you can do it over Skype and.
But I saw Bell Hooks talking with Gloria Steinem, and they said that you really have to, you have to this is kind of allows, you have to she said, Bell Hooks said you have to shopping with someone to do activism with them. But we have to, it's nice to like the people that you're working with.
There's one question here.
Some of the posters that were up were in Cyrillic. Could you talk a little bit more about those, and if you were working in Russia, what the experience was in working with that kind of society that's so much more closed and so much more immovable than the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, at a certain moment, I think it was in 2013 or 2014, we were kind of invited to go to a conference in Moscow that was a human rights conference, to go as Fierce Pussy. And for various reasons, we decided not to accept the invitation, because particularly at that time, there was a huge crackdown on LGBT people in Russia. So instead, what we did was we translated our list posters into Russian, and we sent the posters instead. And as we say to everybody, you should just, feel free to download this poster, print it out, wheat paste it, put it up anywhere you want, because we don't own it. We don't own it. It's totally freely distributable. So that's what we did at that moment.
That relates to what I was trying to think about before, about when we made our book, we made it as on almost like calendar style with a spiral at the top so that you could flip the page. You could potentially tear it out, but you could also just flip the page and Xerox it as many times as you want and use them. Or now we do have our website, finally, that there are PDFs on there, and people can, it's a little bit an answer to your question of just like, anyone can use these. We want people to feel free to put them up. But that's why we made our book with a hole for a nail and a spiral, so they could actually use the books similarly to how we were using them on the streets, the posters.
Something I'm curious about is so much of the language in your individual work is rooted in abstraction versus the collective work is more literal. And I'm just curious about the decision making behind that, and if you feel like the abstract has a place in activist art, or if the literal is easier to understand and has more a power to it.
No, I was just going to say that I thought I spent rather a bit of time to try to persuade you that abstraction is actually at work in the Fierce Pussy posters, but I guess you don't buy it. But I actually think that what's really exciting about them is that, yes, it's using images and words that we think that we know, but I think that what's striking about them is that they get pulled away from the ways that we expect them to refer. So that the address of the you and the I, for example, isn't so obvious, or the ways that we would expect Dyke to correspond with image isn't at work in the Dyke blazoned over the little girl, which isn't asking us to think about abstraction as not just the look of minimalism, but a strategy to actually unhook how reference operates. And so in that sense, I think that we mistake the posters if we think that they're just simple, that I think they're actually, there's a great deal of, for example, what is, the opening question of what's the relationship between art and politics? You could understand this as artists doing politics, but I think that actually what's really interesting is its aesthetic tactics being used for political ends, and including an activation of abstraction for political ends, which is what I think is really exciting about the work. Abstraction not as just non-representational, but representation no longer working in the ways that it's conventionally expected to work.
But I think at that time when we were first meeting around an ACT UP, having a private or personal art practice was complicated. I'll speak for myself. It was a lot to working together as a collective. I was very grateful that I had a place and a community of people to express some direct ideas, many, that was more literal and representational. Moving into my own work, I don't work from that place personally, but I'm not against anyone thinking of it that way. I'm not against myself thinking of that way. It's not my first place, probably, but I am accepting of that lens or view in, and I think they both can exist.
I think there's a lot. All these things are going on at the same time. you think you might have a shade you can pull down between this and that, but you can't. There's a lot of osmosis, and your reaction in one situation, which may be very grave and upsetting and all kinds of things. There's all these things that you take with you and you put into what you're doing. I'd actually even say that abstraction is a difficult word, but I think if we talk about it in the sense that you're talking about it, like carrying away, or just for an example, in the foldograms that I'm doing, I think of them as quite subversive. You don't know what you're looking at. You can't read me. And at this point in time, I don't want to be read. I want you to be afraid of me. I don't want it to be, yes, I think there's totally a place for all the things that we're talking about here, but I think there's certain things that we have to be also, I wouldn't say protective, but it's almost like a wink to someone that you understand me, but I don't have to agree with this that may cause us a problem, right? So I don't know if I'm being clear, but I really feel that way. So in the photograms,
I also think in your photograms, you are quite consciously breaking a lot of the rules of photography. Like, you're never supposed to ding the surface, and you're not supposed to crack the emulsion, and you're supposed to use the paper as a receptive surface upon which it receives an image that most of the time is from the world. And you're kind of subverting all of those strictures in your practice.
yeah.
And I'd say for myself, the embedded work that I'm doing now, this idea of cutting into a wall, embedding, occupying that space, like one could say penetrating or taking hold of a space that is not normally used in that way. Is that a political gesture? I'll leave that to you.
You could also say you were queering the space, right? I mean, you may think you're looking at something a certain way, but fact, yoo-hoo, hi, So there's ways in which, there's ways in which that happens. Like
in my own practice, in the past few years, I've been thinking a lot about recto verso, like the thing that's on the face that you, the viewer, look at. But then there's also a side that's hidden, that's facing the panel, that's facing the back, facing the wall. And I'm interested in looking at that relationship between what's visible and what's hidden.
Anybody else?
Hi, so some of the words that you used when you first began talking about your collective work were retrospective, hindsight, and urgency. And you said at first it was not your intention to create work about time, but those were words that kind of struck a chord with me when you were talking. And I'm wondering if that sense of urgency that you felt when you first began making work because you felt like you didn't have enough time, or the people around you didn't have enough time, is kind of what has led you to make work about time, or do you think that it's more of a retroactive realization that your work became about time? So I guess my question is, retroactively, are you realizing that that's what your work is about, or did it kind of evolve into that?
I think it's evolving because actually if I think about the transmission, we very consciously at that moment, in 2016 when we started working on it, did not want to be in the present. We wanted to posit like a point of view from the future to the present. So that was really a conscious decision on our part.
But
check something really fast, which is that what I understood time to be doing was not that the subject matter was time. So that is that the work is not so much about time, but using time travel as a way of intervening in how we live, what our viability might be, what the political might look like, how it might operate, what it might mean to realize the promise of something like democracy for livable lives, and that it would be necessary to use time differently to interrupt the impossibility of the present, but also interrupt the presumption that time necessarily works progressively in order to realize the promise of something like a livable life or even a political future. So I guess I would just, I'm so glad you brought up time again, that there's so much to work. I'm anxious about the subject somehow becoming time. I think that what I'm hoping that we could start to think about is that time can be a political device, or aesthetic tool for political ends.
I mean, also say, you're only getting like a little sampling of what we all do, but I guess time is an element for me that I want to slow people down and have them sort of take in the moment and just be, because I don't think people do that. So I have a lot of work that works in that way. I mean, it would be hard to totally explain it, but I have a lot of video pieces that are shot literally in real time, and you experience them in real time, but a lot of other things happen. So from what I understand, they're not boring, but you know, I understand that too, but I don't know how to totally explain it. We have a little clip of one of them, but you want to play that? Yeah. So this piece is actually long. It's like over an hour long, and it was shot in a market in Paris, and it was from an aerial viewpoint. And I've been shooting things like this. I think of them as like social sculptures. So where nothing exists, and then something happens and gets built, and people use it, and it gets taken down. And in this case, it was in well, you can't hear it, I think.
As I was thinking I might take a cat nap, or at least rest my eyes, I noticed light seeping out from under door number 3. Someone was up. As I pushed the cat to the floor, the door opened, and a man emerged, backlit, wearing a dark red velvet bathrobe. Monsieur G, I thought. Before I could say bonjour, he asked why I was sitting in the dark, and turned on the hallway light. I stood up saying hi, walked over to shake his hand, said I hadn't wanted to disturb them, and introduced myself. He seemed friendly, actually quite chipper for 5:30 a.m. In fact, for a split second, he reminded me of my father, who always seemed to wake up happy and whistling. Monsieur immediately asked, how was it going? I said very well, all proceeding as I hoped, already recording tape number 5, and I thanked him for letting me film in their home. Heading towards the kitchen, Monsieur G asked if I'd like some breakfast. Being slightly shy with someone I've just met in the dark, in their bathrobe, on top of feeling a little like a cat burglar sneaking into his home, I said no thanks. Merci beaucoup, perhaps a cup of tea. And added, I brought my own tea bag. He said he put on the kettle and proceeded into the kitchen. I sat frozen on the couch for a moment, had that he thought I was dozing off on his couch and with his cat. I decided to look busy. I went outside and checked the camera, came back inside and sat on the couch. As I was making a few notes on the progress below, I thought about how my vantage point differed from that of the camera lens, its particular focal length, and the sweep of what falls within its range. When I noticed a massive accumulation of white cat hair sticking to the velvet corduroy couch. I jumped up and quickly tried to remove the cat hair from the cushions with my now sweaty palms by rubbing in a circular motion, which actually worked well. As it came off, I rolled the hair between my hands, making it into a fur ball, which I shoved into my handbag to dispose of later.
So, there were these two psychoanalysts that I had met, and I had done some other work with years ago, and I had been thinking about shooting a market, and I knew this market in Paris, and because we'd stay with a friend who lived right near there, and so Carrie and I were quite familiar with it, and I thought, oh, that would be a good thing. That would be kind of fit my idea, and so this friend of mine who's also a shrink said, well, why don't you ask Monsieur and Madame G if they actually have their apartment overlooks Place Jeanne d'Arc, and so I did, and I'd never met Monsieur G, but I had met Madame before, and so I went there, and she showed us around her apartment, and it was very particular, like, she showed us every room and her study and their bedroom and the bathroom, and, and gave me keys. And so I started shooting the buildup of the market the day before in the afternoon, and it was out on their terrace, and I made marks on the terrace floor where the camera would get set up, and I shot the first part, which is that first section. So when you're seeing the video, it's actually set up in 3. And so that first is that first afternoon, and the next is like 4 o'clock in the morning. So I come into their apartment at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she's already said she's a light sleeper. So I think, mental note, light sleeper. And I come in, and the first thing I see are these two eyeballs, these little orbs looking at me. It's their cat, and the cat doesn't want to make friends at first, but I also don't want to, disturb them. And so, I get the camera set up, and it's shooting market, and you see all these things happen, and there's all these like vignettes, and it's all happening in real time, right? But in the meantime, I got the whole thing going on the other side of the camera with the two psychoanalysts, and that goes on for the rest of the day. And a lot of times when I work, I don't really know like how everything's going to work out. I just kind of start with some ideas, and every time I started editing the footage, all I could think about were what happened in the apartment on the other side of the camera. So I think I shot it in 2013, I think, or earlier, maybe, or I think it was like maybe 2010. And so I was editing for a long time, and then I started to write what happened on the other side of the camera with the psychoanalysts, and which took kind of a long time, like 6 years. And who knows, like, as we all know, we embellish. So it was as much as I remembered and how I thought about it, and my own, psychosis probably in there. And so what you hear, so what you're seeing in front of you, you become the membrane, the viewer becomes the camera. And what you're seeing is what happened in real time, what the camera saw, and what you're hearing is what happened on the other side of the camera. And also you see that it's in black and white, but the only time color is mentioned to you is I'll tell you, like, the couch was brown velvet, or so you're now having this other kind of or at least I hope moment, adventure, I don't know, something in time. So yeah, so I don't know if that answers part of the time question, but I think about time a lot.
Is that it?
So I just have a do you want to?
Well, I just wanted to say, if that was it, I just want to say that I want to say thank you to Joey, to the Beeler,
to Jill,
to Carrie. But yeah, and the Beeler is such a great opportunity for us. It's such a beautiful space that we're really looking forward to coming here and working. And just there's a lot we could say about that. But Joey's whole way of thinking about using time and allowing for time, and that we're going to have 6 months here, and it's just a terrific, exciting opportunity, and we're really happy about it. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
never know what will drum up.
Well, just to closing comment about my interest in bringing you all together and thinking through your individual practices is, we see in the video, the diagonal pieces that are being put on by the workers reminded me of the slotted diagonals that Nancy does, and the inside-outside kind of duality reminds me of Zoe's work. So this 6 months is really going to be this sort of not only time traveling, but traveling from one work to another, from one medium to another, one material to another, and that I think hasn't been given the public platform that largely we do talk about how politics, the urgency of that, and we do want to talk about that, but there are other many opening up that I hope that we do together. Lastly, we printed the transmission for this season, and it's gonna be available for the rest of the year. Hopefully we run out before the rest of the year. Please do take a sheet and tell your friends about it to get more. Thank you so much.